We're on Daf Gimel Amud Aleph, and if you count down, I would say approximately 12, maybe 15 lines down, you'll see the first word on the line is Shahaisa. And if you scoot across that line, we're going to start with the words Minayin Litzion. And we discussed in our Mishnah the concept of Tzion Kvarim. And the Mishnah talks about all the different Tzarchei Rabbim and the necessary malachos that we do, even though it's the 15th of Adar, and even if we're in an Ir Mukefes Choma, so it's Purim. And on the list that's enumerated in the Mishnah, we have Mitzainin ala Kvaros. So we need to mark the place where a corpse is buried. And Minayin Litzion, is there some sort of an allusion, or at least some sort of a remez in the Psukim of the Torah or somewhere in Tanakh that teaches us that we're required to make simonim on the graves, on the kvaros, and the method that they used back at the time of the Mishnah is what's called lime or sid, and that's called shvichas sid. So they would put a stone on top of the grave and then pour lime on top of the stone, and that would keep the stone permanently affixed in its place. Just pointing out, not that it's so relevant, but the language minayin litzion in the parallel sugya in the Bavli, which is Moikot Daf Hey, there it says remez litzion kvaros minatora minayin. And I would suggest, although I can't prove this to you, that whenever you see the language in the Gemara, remez li, and then it says mina Torah minayin, which is almost a stira, minei uvei, because if you're talking about a remez, then it's not d'oraisa, it's just a asmachta. But then you say mina Torah minayin, and that implies that it's d'oraisa. Whenever you see that kind of a structure, which appears throughout Shas, it means that the mitzvah or the Isser is d'oraisa, but the Rabbanan will define and specify exactly under which circumstances you violate that Isser or you fulfill that mitzvah. I mean, just to give you one example, and then we'll go on. At the end of Masechet Kiddushin, it says, Minayin le'Isser yichud, it says the following, Remez le'Isser yichud min haTorah minayin. And the Gemara quotes a parsha of Meses that has nothing to do with Isser yichud. So therefore, it's only a remez. But the poskim say that since it says min haTorah minayin, it means that what the Rabbanan are doing here through this remez is they're creating a framework within which, or the specific details and conditions within which a person will violate an Isser d'oraisa. So that when it says remez le'Isser yichud min haTorah, we're talking about an Isser d'oraisa. Now, I'm not saying all the Rishonim will agree with that, the Rambam not, but most Rishonim would maintain that under certain circumstances, if the door's locked and it's an erva, it's d'oraisa. And we look for a remez in the Torah, but once we have that remez, we're dealing with an Isser d'oraisa. Here in the case of Tumah, obviously, for many reasons, we want to make sure that people know that there's Tumah over here. First and foremost, because you don't want to contract Tumah. And that's true not only for Kohanim, but even for Yisraelim, because Yisraelim want to maintain Tara. So you have to tell them, don't go near this place because you will contract Tumah. Secondly, of course, for the Kohanim have a specific Isser of not to be Mitami Lemes, that's a Doraisa. And therefore, the marker will tell them that there's Tumah over here. Now, if we're talking about Tumah and we're dealing with a case of a mess, we're going to have to figure out, and that's what our sugya is going to address, under what circumstances, how much of a mess do you have in order to generate a chiyuv tziyun kever, which really means with regard to a mess, there's something called tumas ohel, and we'll see soon that there are many different ways of contracting tumas ohel, but one of them, which is most relevant to us, is called mahil alames. It's not that you and the corpse are under one common roof, but that you are leaning over a mess. And therefore, if not for this marker, this siyun, you might contract tumas mess if you go over the mess. So therefore, we need some sort of a siyun to tell us and notify us, stay away, because this is where there's a mess buried. And the Gemara now, and it's in Bavli and also here in the Yerushalmi, is looking for a source for this requirement of setting up a tziyun kever, as we said before, shfichas sid, not just to put a stone on top, because that's not a tziyun. The tziyun is that they poured lime on top of the stone, and that was well recognized by everyone at the time, that means there's a kever there, there's a mess that's buried there. That's called tziyun. And now we're looking for a source in the Torah. Now, in general, although there are special laws with regard to a mess, for example, mahil al a mess, which means tumas oel, which doesn't apply to other tumas, like for example, a mitzora. So you can contract tuma by contact with a mitzora, by carrying a mitzora, and we'll see in certain cases there is something called tumas hesed. But one thing is for sure, that although the tuma of tsaras, for example, is not as chamor as the tuma of mess, vis-a-vis this concept of mahil ala mess, that's unique to tumas mess. Nevertheless, even in the case of tsaras, I have to know that such a person is tamei b'tumas tsaras in order to avoid contact with that person. So I shouldn't contract tuma. Again, it's not going to be the same kind of a marker like we're talking about putting a stone over a corpse and then covering it with lime. Obviously, that's not appropriate in the case of a mitzora, but yet the Torah says that the mitzora is obligated to notify people in his anywhere around him in proximity that he is tamei. He's got to notify them so that they will take care and not contract tumah. And this is going to be derived from an extra word in the pasuk, a word that's totally redundant. Now, exactly who derived this halacha of tziyun from the Parsha Mitzora, the Gemara has a major dispute about who it was. You see, the Gemara, this is very good for Purim. You know, the Gemara Chazal tell us in Masechet Megillah that because Esther said it in the name of Mordechai, you know, with the killing of Bigtzav Viseresh, that's what brought about the Geula. Ha'omer David b'Shem Omer. So this is a wild example of how far the Gemara goes, how much ink is being spilled to try to say it b'Shem Omer. So you have here Rabbi Brechia, who's saying in the name of Rabbi Yaakov Bar Bas Yaakov, who's saying it in terms of b'Shem Rab Chunya de Boras Chavrin. He came from a town called Boras or Bras Chavrin, and that's where Rab Chunya was from. Apparently, it's based on a pasuk in Yechezkel. That name, it's not just a name, but it dates back to biblical times, because Yechezkel speaks about a place called Gvul Chavron. The Bavli has a slightly different name for it. It's called a Bikas Beis Chavrason. Okay, so Mitch is not here today with his Steinsaltz Gemara. I'm sure Rabbi Steinsaltz will have a whole paragraph here on how to identify this place called Bras Chavrin. Anyway, that's where Rav Chunya came from. Now that's one tradition that brings this drasha and attributes it to Rav Chunya. Now we have another lineage here, another line of transmission, and that's Rabbi Yosa Amrile. He says it in the name of Rabbi Yaakov bar Acha b'shem Rabbi Chunya de Bras Chavrin, Rabbi Chizkiah says in the name of Rav Uziel, Braid Rav. It's just like a who's names list here. But b'shem Rav Chunya de Beis Chavrin. Anyway, whoever said it, they found a remez for Tzion Kever in the parsha of Mitzorah. Now we're in Vayikra Perek Yud Gimel, and the pasuk says V'atzarua asher boa nega begadov yu prumim rosho yeparua valsofam yate. Now here's the key of keys: V'tame tame yikra, which literally means he cries out tame tame. And why does the Torah say tame twice? From the double language of tame tame, we're going to derive this principle that you have to make a siman on tuma, kidei shetea tuma koralach b'fia v'yomer s'lecha prosh. Now, it's very interesting because remember I told you that this sugya appears in the Bavli in Moed Katan Daf Hey, but there the Gemara explains why it had to say Tameh twice. What would have meant if it would have just said once Tameh Yikra? How would we have interpreted that? So fascinating is that the Bavli saw the word Tameh Yikra as a moral responsibility, so to speak, or I shouldn't say responsibility, because again, it's the Mitzorah himself who's crying out Tameh. But the Gemara says that the Mitzorah is crying out Tameh, Odiat Sa'aro L'Rabim V'Rabim Mevakshim Olav Rachamim. Fascinating, no? According to the Bavli, this is all to generate a moral responsibility or an interpersonal relationship between the tzibur at large and the Mitzorah. The Mitzorah is suffering tsar, he's being excluded from the Rabbim, so he screams out where he is chutz lamachna that people should identify and commiserate with his suffering, and as a result, they will daven on his behalf. So this is a famous tshuva from a Moshe Feinstein in Igros Moshe that's so relevant today with regard to Corona. Can I be Makayim the mitzvah Bikur Cholim on the telephone? That was the question that was raised by Rav Moshe, and he said, it's not the same as going to visit the Chola, but nevertheless it is considered a kiyum. If you visit the Chola, you can get additionally what Rav Moshe calls la hafigo mitzaro, means he's very lonely, and you show up to cheer him up. And secondly, when you look at the chola and you see Nebuch, if he's in bad shape, your tefillos are that much more profound. But even in the case of Mitzorah, when you hear the Mitzorah crying out Tameh from a distance, you can at least identify to some extent with his tsar, and therefore you'll be Makayim your mitzvah of quote unquote Bikur Cholim by being Mavakesh Rachamim on his behalf. But now there's a second word Tameh. And the Gemara says that the second word Tameh is coming not for some sort of moral reason of compassion and having people daven on your behalf, but rather Korala B'fia V'omelo Prosh. The second Tameh is to notify people that they should stay away and they should be Poresh Mimenu so that they shouldn't contract Tumah. And once again, as I said before, the case of Mitzorah is not exactly equivalent to the case of Tziyun Kvaros, because in the latter case, we're talking about Tumas Ohel, which doesn't apply in the case of Mitzorah. So Mitzorah, the Tziyun is from a distance, and it's not a physical object, it's just sound waves. It's notifying the people, don't be Mitame over here. Don't come too close because you'll be shall we say, you'll contaminate yourself with tumah. So this is a matter of alerting people, alerting them that they will avoid contracting tumah from him. And now we're up to the second answer to the question, Minayin Litzion. And the Minayin Litzion in the second answer, which is Rav Ila B'Shem, Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachman, now we're looking for a remez for Tzion Kvarin, not for the general all-inclusive obligation to alert people to Tumah so that they should not contract Tumah, but rather to a specific chumrah of Tumas Mes, which is Ohel HaMes. And that's what Rabbi Elah is going to advance our knowledge by quoting a pasuk in Yechezkel, from which he's going to derive this unique halacha that reflects the Tumas Oel to be Ma'al al Hames that applies to a Tziyun Kever. So let's say a few words about Tumas Mes. A mes is metame in one of three ways: maga, masa, and a subcategory of masa is called hesed, and oel. Maga means direct contact with the mes. Masa means even if you don't have direct contact with the mes, you're carrying the mes. And then a subcategory is Masechet ala mes, that you cause the mes to move, even though you're not carrying the mes. And finally, oil. Oil itself subdivides into three categories. The most common is where you, a live person, are in the same oil under the same roof as a corpse. That's number one. Number two is where the mes itself is mahil alatar. So let's say, for example, you're underneath the mes, that itself, so the mes goes, in this case, the tumah goes down, if you follow what I mean. See, let's say you would have a two-story building and there's a mes on the top floor, you're on the bottom floor. Again, you have to know about chatzitza and so forth and so on, but in principle, the mes can be metame going down. And then we have the third subcategory, where the tumas mes is going up, meaning you're above the mes, you're mahil ala mes, and that's what this sugya is all about. Fine. So we have the various scenarios in which one could contract tumas mes. But now we get to the main question: what is a mes? Now, if there's basar, if there's actual flesh of the dead body, then that's metame even with a kazayas. But we're talking about a case where, as a result of the process in which the flesh is worn away, decomposition, if you can use that term, there's no flesh. What you're left with is bones, the atzamos of the deceased. And if you take a look fast forward, I'll get to the pasuk in a minute, but you'll see, if you want to underline the word etzem adam, those two words, etzem adam. The pasuk that Rabbi Elah is going to quote from Yechezkel speaks about etzem adam, the bone of the dead. And in just a minute, we'll talk about the context of this nevuah of Yechezkel about Milchemes Gog Magog. We'll get to that in just a minute. That's less important to me than getting down the basics. Okay. How much of the bone structure, the bones, will be metami ba'ohel? Now, we have a halacha Moshe Sinai, this is the basics, that an etzam hames is metami bikisaora. You've got a bone that is the size of a kernel of barley, a very small bone. And the Gemara tells us in Brachos in the Agadah that Rabbi Yochanan actually walked around with such a bone of what Nebuch, the children that he buried, the last child. I'm not going into that; it's too depressing for me. I mean, this whole sugya is a little bit depressing. But I have to tell you, the Rav, Rav Soloveitchik wrote a famous essay called Ish Halacha, Halachic Man. And he says there, he reports about his grandfather, Reb Chaim, that whenever he was overcome by fear of death, he would learn Masechet Olos. And he'd be Mechadish Chidushim in Olos, and it brought him to the state of Simcha. You got to be a halachic man for that. That you're depressed about the inevitability of man, inevitable death, and you're going to learn Olos, and that's going to bring you to a state of Simcha. Again, that's a madrega of a halachic man. I'm not on that madrega, so this sugya gets me a little bit depressed when I think about bones, and automatically I start thinking about the Holocaust. That's the way it goes. That's my psyche. So how much of a bone structure, or how many bones do you need to be metami ba'oel, and therefore generate a chiyuv of tziyun kever to avoid being mahil al hames? So here too we have three subcategories. It seems like today the number 3 is very important. Okay. So the first subcategory is going to be what's called, just 1 second, let me just get the note here in the Masifta. This is called Rov Binyan Hames. What that means is most of the structure of the skeleton. And then we have Rov Minyan. We have individual bones that don't form a skeleton, but it's most of the bones of a body. And Chazal identify that as 125 bones. And finally, the third category is what's called Rova Hakav. And that's more of a volume of bones. All right, so we'll go through, believe me, some of these categories as we go along. First, let's read the Pasuk in Yechezkel and give it a little bit of a background. V'avru ha'ovrim ba'aretz v'ra'a etzem adam ubana etzlo tziyun al kvaro ad kavru oso hamakabrim el gei hamon gog. So let me just first point out the easy part of this pasuk, and that is the word makabrim. Makabrim were those, shall we say, professional grave diggers that are responsible for digging graves. And the situation that Yechezkel's prophesizing in his vision at the end of the Melchemes Gog u'Magog, and the Gog people are dying, and their corpses are all over the place. Eretz Yisrael is completely strewn with the bodies of Gog. And until we can get the Makabrim, who are the professionals who are responsible for digging graves, in the meantime, we need a stopgap measure. And Yechezkel says that stopgap measure is that whenever you see Etzem Adam, and we'll define what that is in just a second, then Ubana Etzlo Tziyun, which means that until we have a proper burial, we need to build a tziyun. And the assumption is that tziyun is for the purpose of avoiding being mahil al hames. Now, I have news for you guys. Mahil al hames would not apply in this case, because a corpse of a guy is only metame the magu v'masa, not the oil. So that this whole limud from Yechezkel is all an asmachta. In other words, we can't take it literally that when Yechezkel says ubana etzlo tziyun, he's talking about tziyun kever in the pure halachic chiyuv in the obligation sense, because that would not apply if there's no tumas oil. In fact, the Gemara now is going to go through the entire pasuk piece by piece in order to define which situations in which there would be tumas oil. But the pasuk itself could not possibly be addressing tumas oil, because we're talking about a non-Jew, the people of Gog. In any event, Mikan, says Rabbi Ila, mitzainin al hatzamos. Now, the emphasis here is on the word hatzamos, as I said before, because it's already after equal basar. Because if it's equal basar, if there's still basar there, that's a whole different set of halachas. And if there's a corpse or part of the flesh of a corpse, that's something that you see. We're talking about bones. And in the case of bones, it's not always obvious that you see the bones. And certainly if you're at a distance, by the time you pass over the bones, it might be too late. And you already contracted too much OL because you're mile LMS. So we have now a case of atzamos, v'nisakel habasa. There's no basar left, no flesh is left. And how much of the atzamos do we have? Either rov minyan, or a shear of rova hakaf. Now, I found something interesting here in the English translation, which I wanted to call to your attention. First, he says that which I think is pretty obvious. He says that these markers are mandated because of Tumas Ohel. Okay, that we know. And wherever there's a possibility that a person, by passing over the mess, would contaminate himself with Tumas Ohel, a marker is called for. And as far as he says Tuma through contact of Maga or Hesed or Masa, that all you would need is to bury the mess. You don't need a Tziyun Kever for that. You understand? He's trying to explain why the requirement of Tziyun Kever is generated only by Ohel. What about Masa or Hesed or Maga? The answer is, for that, burial would suffice. Just simply bury the corpse. There's no need for a marker. You know, once the mess is underground, there's no Maga, there's no Maseh, there's nothing. The only possibility is Mahil ala mes. Now he says the following: a bone from one of Gog's soldiers would not transmit corpse tuma, that's what he calls tuma, it's corpse tuma, through Ohel. Why? He says, first of all, because if it's an individual bone, then generally speaking, you don't have mahil on an individual bone. You would be worried about mago masa, and therefore burial would be sufficient. But furthermore, he says, non-Jewish corpses, even if it be the whole corpse, which certainly requires a tziyun kever l'chora, would not transmit tumah through Ohel. So therefore, in our verse, the scenario of Yechezkel here, burial would be sufficient. You don't need a marker because there's no tumas Ohel in the case of Gog, of a soldier of Gog that died. So Yechezkel here is prophesying that after the Milchemes Gog u'Magog, Eretz Yisrael be littered with the corpses of the Gog's army. And even after we clean up the place, but we still know that there are isolated human bones, and you're required to build a marker. And let's just look at the language of the pasuk. The pasuk says, "Ubana etzlo tziyun." Please underline the word etzlo. That's going to be a very critical word here, because you would have said "Ubana olav tziyun." On top of the mess, you should have put the tziyun. No. We don't put the mess, we don't put the marker, the tziyun, on top of the mess, but rather etzlo, on the side of the mess. We'll try to understand why that's so. But the main thing that I wanted to share with you here in this footnote is the following. The general rule is that a human bone or bones that are the size of a barley kernel, that's etzem kisaora, convey tuma through maga or masa, but not through oel. So whenever you hear the halach l'mot Sinai of etzem kisaora and tumas mes, you're talking about either maga or masa, but not oil. In what cases, in what situations is there tumas atzamos of oil? Would there be a case, and in fact there are three such categories, where there's tumas oil from atzamos? Number one, rova kav of atzamos. And in such a case, we don't need rov binyan or rov minyan. We don't care whether we have majority, like we said before, 125 bones or anything like that. We don't care whether we have the framework, meaning the skeleton. You've got individual bones, less than majority of the bones, but it's such a volume that it reaches rovaka. Number two, if you have a skeleton and just 1 second. And you have what's called rov binyan. You have most of the skeleton. And again, most of the skeleton would be less than most of the bones of the body. There are many, many other bones besides the skeleton bones. But once you have the skeleton, which is called the shidra, that's enough if you have rov binyan. That's called rov binyan. And then, so again, keep in mind, the rov binyan is less than rov hakav, because otherwise I don't need rov binyan. So you have less than rov hakav, you have less than rov hatzomos, but you have rov binyan. You have most of the skeletal bones. That's enough to be mitami ba'oel. And the third category, in addition to rov hakav and rov binyan, is rov minyan. If you have not the skeleton and you don't have a rov hakav, but you have most of the bones of the body. Okay. Now, just 1 second. Just looking for one second. How come I? Okay. Just give me one more minute. If I don't find it, we'll just leave it out. Just a second. Okay, I don't know why I'm not finding it here. I thought it was here, but I'm not finding it. Maybe I'll find it a little bit later. Okay. Now, the Gemara says the following. Let's go through every word in this pasuk in Yechezkel. First, the word Adam. What does Adam refer to? Mikan shemitzaymin al hashidra, and Rav Shlomo Surleo adds im hatzalaot. So now we have a shidra, which is a spinal column, and it has all its vertebrae, which are called slaot in Hebrew. And then we have another category of Adam, and that is Hagilgolas, the skull. So now we've expanded Tumas Oel from 3 subcategories to 5 subcategories, because Shidra, with its slows, and Gulgoles does not fit into any of the other categories. It's not Rovakav, it's not Rov Binyan, right? It's not the entire skeleton, and it's not Rov Minyan. It's not most of the bones in the body. So take, for example, Gulgoles, right? A skull. A skull does not have Rov Binyan, Rov Minyan. It's not Rov Akav, but yet it's Mitami Ba'oel. And he gives an explanation for this in the name of the Bartanura, and he says that it's Lefisha Tsuras Adam Nikeres Bahem. Okay, Tsuras Adam Nikeres Bahem. Okay. Now, why does he darshan so much on the word Adam? It seems that the word Adam here is an allusion to a pasuk in Parshas Chukas, in the Parsha of Tumas Mes, which is Bamidbar Perek Yutes. Because there it says, "V'chol asher yiga be'etzem Adam yitma shivas yamin." Now the whole parsha there is talking about the remains of a human body, and it's mitame be Tumas Oel and Tumas Mes. Why does it mention be'etzem Adam? The word Adam is already superfluous. The Torah is now telling us in the word Adam that you may have something that's mitami ba'oel because it is Turas Adam Nikeres Bahem, which means that you can recognize the human form. Next, Ubana. What is the significance of the word Ubana in this pasuk? And the answer is binyan kavua. In other words, we need something that's attached to the ground. So let's say, for example, you would simply put a stone on top of the corpse. That would not constitute and serve as a tziyun kever, because unless the stone is attached to the ground, which is called kavua, then it can roll from one place to the other. And now the Gemara is going to explain why that's a problem. She'im omer ata, or at, al gabi even tlusha, if you're not talking about a stone that is firmly attached to the ground, but rather it's tlusha, it's detached, then says the Gemara, af hi holeches, this stone might roll umitame b'makom acher. Now, honestly, if not for one of the commentaries he quotes, we haven't gotten a chance to go through an overview of all the commentaries, Rabbeinu Mishulam, which was discovered not long ago, the manuscript. I don't know how I would interpret these 3 words, mitame b'makom acher. The stone itself is not mitame, the mess is mitame. So what does it mean mitame b'makom acher? So Rabbeinu Meshulam says that those who pass by, they see this stone and they assume that there's a corpse below the stone. I don't know exactly why, maybe because they recognize that this stone was used as a marker. They don't realize that it was blown away and it rolled down. So therefore, they're going to be metame b'makom acher. What's so terrible about that? And the answer is, he says, Nimtzenu shemitamim taros shelo kidin. Let's say, for example, I'll give you the scenario of an extreme of a Kohen who's carrying truma, and he crosses over this stone. He's going to assume that this is oil al mes, and he's going to assume that the truma became truma tmeya. It did not become truma tmeya. It's still Torah, and now he's going to go and burn the truma. Again, I don't see that in the text of Rabbeinu Meshulam, but that's in my mind what's going on here. That mitami b'makom acher is not a good thing, because if there's no tuma and you're going to take something that's tar and be mitami, you might end up burning truma tahora. That's what I think is going on over here. He says, "V'yatamu sham b'li mason." I guess he means mason with a sin, not a tough. B'li mason, meaning without paying attention. It's not really tummy. He doesn't know. Now, the Tiklin Chadatin that we quoted many times, he says that there's an additional problem here. When the Gemara says umitami b'makom acher, what the Gemara has in mind is that the passers-by will assume that the tumah is in place Y, and they won't realize that it's in place X, where the burial, the gravesite is. So they're going to assume that they're tar when they pass over the gravesite because the stone is no longer there. And that's very logical. Then we get to the word etzlo. Ubana etzlo tziyun. It doesn't say ubana olav tziyun. It means that the tziyun has to be l'makom tahara. It should not be over the tumah, over the mess itself, but rather etzlo. Why? So he quotes Rashi in Masechet Bava Kama, Moed Katan, because as I told you, this Gemara is also Moed Katan. And Rashi explains that im yases hatziyun al mokom atuma mamish, if he puts the stone and then the lime on top of the stone over the kever, yesh lachshol sha'ovrim v'shavim lo yavchinu bekach ad sha'omdim al hatziyun mamish. Ukvar nitmu hataros shebiyadeim. Lefichach marchik es hatziyun ben atuma, hidei shebebo el hatziyun kvar yargish miyad v'lo yael al atuma. In other words, if all you have is a marker directly on top of the mess, it could be that you might pass over the marker without realizing it. So you've already contracted tumah. Better that we put you a sign, in advance. It's like, imagine if you're going on a tiyul and there's a drop, some sort of a ditch. You don't want to put the sign right there near the ditch, because by the time he gets to see the sign, he's already on the bottom of the ditch. You want to put it at a distance. And then the final word in the pasuk that we need here is the word tziyun. Mikan litziyun. This is going to be the source for the chiyuv that we derive at tziyun. Now, what are the next words that you have in your Gemara? It should say umatza even achas. Am I right? So the Korban Eda says it should say Toshma. That's what's missing in the Yerushalmi. We're talking now about somebody who's walking on the road. Umata even achas mitzuyenes. Mitzuyenes means he finds a stone that's covered with lime, and that's a siman that there's tumah there. Afal pishein mekaymin kain hamayil oleha tame. Again, a very strange, ambiguous language of the Yerushalmi. Afal pishein mekaymin kain. We don't keep it as it is. What does that mean? He says, again, quoting in this case the Taklin Chadatin, that Ein Mekayim means he wasn't Mekayim the mitzvah of Tziyun Kever. What did he do? Osa Satziyun al Gabe Atuma Atzma. So this brisa that we're about to learn is addressing the case of a deviant, so to speak. He deviated from the law, and his tziyun was not the right tziyun because he put the tziyun directly on top of the mess, which we said before. The pasuk says etzlo, but not on top, not ola. And the brisa tells me that what do we assume in the case of a person who crossed on top of a tziyun? Just 1 second. Oh, here's the deal. Since the halacha requires that the tziyun be etzlo and not olav, if a person now went over the kever, he should be tar, because he has every right to assume that below the marker there's no tumah. Comes along the Bryce, says no. Hamayel oleh tame, if he goes over, bends himself over the tziyun, he's tame. Why? Because maybe in fact there's a corpse below the tziyun, and whenever you go over the tziyun, you have to be choshesh that maybe the person who put that tziyun was ignorant, or he made a mistake, and he thought that he has to put the tziyun right directly over the corpse. And here we're going to paskin safek tuma lahachmir, and we're going to assume that based on the possibility, the chash that we have to suspect that maybe the mitzayin, we'll call him, made a mistake and he put the tziyun on top of the mess. Therefore, there is a mess underneath the tziyun. Shema hamitzayin asa shalo kidbin umes mitzuyan v'yanasun oleh. All right, there's a whole discussion here about the language of mes mitzuyan. There are other girsos here. I don't think it's so important for us to go through this. There's a girsa that says mes mekuvatz or kamutza. In any event, this is not the normal burial, and we have to worry about the fact that it's not the normal burial. Now, Rabosai, I'm sure the thought is crossing your mind that this whole sugya seems to be contrary to what we know about Tzion Kvaros. I mean, I'm sure you've been to funerals. I mean, we put the Tzion on top of the mess. Okay. Okay. Now we're up to Hayu Stein. So you now have Shtei Avonim Mitsuyonos Bitzid V'Revach Beineya. So you have two stones with lime on each of them, one near the other with an area in between. Now, if you're mahil on the area in between, you and I would have said intuitively, you're tar. Why? Because there are two mason here, and they set up two tsiyunim directly on top of the two mason. But in the area between the two tsiyunim, there is no mess. But here we're going to go in the opposite direction. We're going to say that the tsiyunim were placed there kidas ukidin, which means that the tziyun should be at a distance from the mess to warn you about it. And the mess is not directly over the two tziyunim. Therefore, if he's mile on the area between the two tziyunim, he is tameh. Hamayel alehem. If he is mile on the tziyunim themselves, tar. Ubeineim, but if he's mile on the area between them, then we have to assume that's where the mess is. And therefore he's tongue. So it means that when you see two tziyunim, you don't assume that in such a tight area there are two mason, and therefore you're going to be matire yourself if you only walked in between the two tziyunim. No, on the contrary, the two tziyunim in close proximity were placed there kedasu kidin to tell you that there's a mess in between these two markers. So if you're walking, from north to south, you'll see the tziyun. If you're walking from south to north, you'll see the tziyun, or whatever direction. And it's a forewarning that you're about to plunge into an area where there's a mess. And now we're going to assume that everything was done kedasu kidin, and there are no mesim underneath the respective tziyunim, because that's not where you put the tziyun, as the pasuk says etzlo, but rather the mess is in between the two tziyunim, and that's where you'll be makabel tuma. Again, if there was only one marker, and if he was mile on that one tziyun, we're going to be choshesh that maybe they didn't do it properly and there's a mess directly on it. But when there's an area that's, crowded and there's two markers next to each other, then we're going to assume Adarabah. The purpose of the two markers was to fulfill the ideal halach of Etzlo, to notify them that in the area between the two markers, that's where there's tumah. Im hoya choresh beintayim. Okay, now we're talking about a case where there's a plowed area. Choresh means charisha, between the two siyunim, between these two stones. Now, if there's a mess there, you're not allowed to do charisha on an area because that's going to break, the bones and so forth into different pieces, and it's going to spread around. I mean, we have something called tuma space apras, but that's only b'di'evet. L'chatchila, a person would not directly plow in a place where there's a mess. And now we have an area between the two stones, the two markers, and it's charush, it's plowed. So we're going to assume for sure that he was not choresh, a place where there's tumah, and the charish itself indicates she'ein tumah bein ha'avonim. Between the two stones in the area that's choresh, there's certainly no mess, and therefore when he allowed himself to do the charisha there between these two stones, he certainly knew that there was no mess between them. It has the same din as one single stone. And you remember we said that in the case of one single stone, we assume that he perhaps put the stone directly on top of the corpse. Ubeineim tar, usvivo seyen tummy. Svivo sefer means directly underneath the markers, these two markers. So again, Beineim is tar because it's a makom charuch, and it's impossible to assume that there's a mess below a makom charuch. Nobody does charuch on a makom on a place where there's a dead body. And now we go back to the sugya before of one stone, where we said that if he's mile on that one stone, we have to worry and be concerned that maybe he didn't do it properly and there's a mess directly under the stone. And that's called kiyachidios. We see it as if there's one kever here and one kever there. And with one stone, we said we have to be choshesh that there's a mess directly underneath the stone. I was hoping to get to the next mission. Let's see if we can very quickly, and if I have to fill in a little bit more, we'll do that tomorrow, but let's just see. Tani, we learned in a brisa, ein mitzainin ala bosa. So let's say you have a kazayas min ames, and there are no atzamos, it's just flesh. Then, in such a case, we don't assume that there's more than just that kizayis min ames. He knows of that kizayis min ames, and therefore ein mitzainin al habosa. We don't have to make a tziyun for flesh of a dead person. Shemen is akel habosa. Okay. So let me read to you this footnote. We're talking about flesh without bones. And perhaps the flesh has decomposed. So now we're trying to figure out, is there a kazayis mina mi basar mes or is there not? If we assume shemen is akel basar, then what the Gemara is assuming in that case is that there's less than a kazayis mina mes. And if that be the case, there's no tumas oil in less than a kazayis mina mes. Now, he should not be mitzayin this area, because if we assume that there's no kizayis min ames and it's flesh without bones, then once a person sees that tziyun, he's going to mistakenly conclude that if he's mile over the tziyun, he was makabel tumah. Once again, he's going to falsely be metame taros. Rabbi Yusta Bar Shunam boy kume Rabbi Mona. He asked this question in front of Rabbi Mona. Velo nimtza metame taros l'mafreya. In other words, you're implying here shemen is akel abosa is less than a kazayis min ames. Meaning, if there would have been a kazayis min ames, then it would be metame the mahil on this kizayis min ames, and he would be metame taros l'mafreya. He says the following: Madua shalom nitzayin af b'kizayis mitzumtzum shel basar, hare kishe'ein tzion alulim ataros shehilu al atuma litomes l'mafreya kol od shalom nis akil habasar v'adayin yesh bo kizayis. Right? We just finished saying in the Brisa that Ein Mitzayim Ala Basar. It means if there are no bones, then we don't set up a marker for Basar. And the assumption is that Nis'ak Ala Basar. Now Rav Yusta asks the following question. V'lo nimtza mitami taros, if you don't put up a tziyun on the basar, a mitzayim al basar, then you might inevitably or inadvertently end up by being mitame taharos limafreya. And he says the question, lo nimtza mitame taharos limafreya. Amar lei, so Rabbana answered, mutav sheiskalkalu bo lisha'a v'al yiskalkalu bo liolam. So you're asking, why shouldn't we be mitzayim, even if there's only a kezayis of basar, and you're telling me shema nisakel a basar? He says, you know what? If you don't put a tziyun there, then people are olul, meaning they may alulim hataro sheheil al tumo li tamos lemafreya. In other words, now maybe you're right. It's nisakel a basar. But I don't know exactly at what point it became less than a kezayis. What about the people from yesterday or the day before who were mahil on this basar before his aklu basar, when there was still a kezayis basar? And they would be metame taharos because there's a kezayis of basar. And you're telling me, no, let's avoid putting up a marker because nisakel abasa. What do you mean nisakel abasa? It's very nice that you're worried about nisakel abasa and you being mitame taros shalokid bin. But why aren't you worried about the fact that maybe he was mild before it was nisakel, when there was still a kezayis, and he was mitame taros, and you're going to say it's tar? Why? Because there was no tziyun over there. You don't want a tziyun over there. Don't we need a tziyun just in case he was ma'il al ames before his aklus abasa, when there was a kezayis min ames? And Rabbi Mona answers, mutav she's kalkulu bolishah. I would rather be mitami taros lishah. Knows for how long of a time will it take for the kezayis min ames to decompose? It's a pretty quick process. The al yiskalkulu boli olam. Whereas if you put up a marker over this basar without atzamos, right, basar, then you're in a long-term problem over here, because even after nisakal basar and there's no kezayis left, the people are going to assume that there's tumah there, and there's no kezayis min ames there because it's already nisakel, and then they're going to go ahead and be mitame taros. They'll declare that these taros, like Truma Torah, is really tmeah because they assume, as a result of the marker, that there was a kezayis min ames there. So even though you're right, for a short period of time, a window of time between kezayis and hisaklus ames, we are in effect going to be mitar taros, and it's to be mitar tmeos, which is not good. But I'd rather do it that way than set up a tziyun li olam, which means that from now on, people are going to think that there's a kezayis min ames there, and they go ahead and be mitami taros. And that leads us to the next Mishnah. Okay, then. Thank you so much, and wishing you a great day.